Hello, friends and neighbors. Favorite books. Remember when that was a thing? So once again, I have allowed the very first reviewing series I ever did on this channel to lapse. The favorite book series has been stuck at number 52 for a very, very long time, and so I am going to attempt to get that moving again with this review. The fourth book in the Incarnations of Immortality series, Wielding a Red Sword, focuses on the incarnation of war. And with war being, in its own way, as varied and many-faceted a concept as death, I feel like this book had the potential to be as good as On a Pale Horse. And the book does resemble On a Pale Horse in many ways, although all the books have a very similar structure to them. Each story is divided into three parts. The first part focuses on the mortal character who eventually becomes the incarnation and looks at their life and sees how they became the incarnation in the first place. The second part of the book focuses on the office of that particular incarnation, death, war, fate, time, whatever, and looks at how it works, what exactly this person does, and shows the mortal character adjusting to the new job. And this is the part where Piers Anthony has the opportunity to illustrate the different facets of the office, the many different faces of death, or the many different faces of war, or whatever it might be. And this section is also structured in a series of seemingly disconnected vignettes or short stories that are all connected by being related to this office. And then in the last part of the story, we have the actual plot of the story with the inevitable battle with Satan and the incarnation overcoming the wiles of Satan and becoming confident in their office. And with Wielding a Red Sword, I have very mixed feelings about this book. I don't think my feelings about a book have been this mixed since I read My Sister's Keeper. And I'll be honest, when I was about halfway through this book, I was ready to chuck it at a wall and give the most scathing review on here that I possibly could. First of all, the main character, Mim, is an Indian prince. This is a bit of a problem for Piers Anthony because his comfort zone is very thoroughly in Western culture. The whole world that Piers Anthony has designed in this series is based around Judeo-Christian and classical mythology. Now, on its own, this isn't a problem, and the fact that our main character is Hindi would raise a lot of interesting questions of how he is going to interact with this thoroughly Western world that Anthony has set up. How is Mim going to reconcile his own beliefs with the established canon? Is he perhaps going to see the world that we have seen in the first three novels as a Western world in his own viewpoint? That on its own could have been very interesting, but there are only a couple of half-hearted attempts to reconcile the two belief systems, and so we end up with kind of this awkward situation where Anthony's world and Anthony's view of a Western culture is viewed as the right way of thinking, and Mim just kind of has to deal with it. Add to that the fact that Anthony is writing about a religion and a culture that he clearly doesn't fully understand, and his portrayal of Mim becomes insensitive at best and wildly racist at worst. And you really start to wonder what the hell Anthony was thinking in making his main character an Indian prince in the first place. It doesn't really add anything to the story. He doesn't do anything interesting with it, even though he easily could have. And the number of insensitive stereotypes makes the writing of this character incredibly awkward. Also because of this, Mim comes off as thoroughly unlikable. He's elitist, he's sexist, and he's imperialistic, and these could have been written as flaws that he needed to overcome, but they're not portrayed that way. They're just portrayed as part of his character, like, oh, well, you know, he's an Indian prince, and that's just the way that they are. Mim falls in love 3 times over the course of this story, and the story only takes place over the course of a year or two. And each of the times he loses one of his loves, she's pretty much forgotten about as soon as another pretty girl walks into the picture. The only one of these love interests I actually liked was Orb, who thankfully will be the main protagonist in the next story in this series. Rapture was utterly pointless, and Ligeo was basically just a damsel in distress for Mim to go and rescue. And then of course there's the demoness Lila, who is once again there to remind us that yes, Piers Anthony's audience is primarily adolescent boys. How many times does Piers Anthony need to describe a woman's breasts? Apparently, 2 or 3 times in each scene that she's in. Now the middle third of the novel, which is the idea portion, the part where he becomes the incarnation of war, we see, much like on a pale horse, some separate vignette-like scenes of Mim doing his job, going around to different battles around the world and dealing with them as he needs to. But Mars's role in these battles is never made very clear. Is he supposed to repress the violence, enhance it, just stand by and watch? It's never really made clear. And really, these war scenes, and there are 4 of them in total in this part of the novel, these war scenes are basically just vehicles for War to interact with the other 4 incarnations. 1 chapter is devoted to each incarnation, and as you can imagine, it becomes very dull and very pedantic very quickly. And it really doesn't give any sort of insight into why wars are fought and why they exist and are they right or wrong and how can they be used and misused. They're basically just vehicles to show us that, oh look, Satan is messing with Mars. Well, yeah, that's kind of par for the course at this point in the series. Did we really need 4 chapters to establish that? So with the first part of the novel being insulting and the second part of the novel being boring, I was fully ready to give this novel a worthless rating and possibly even a rare less than worthless rating, which I would like to point out I have only given out twice in my entire life. Once for a book, once for a movie. But then the last third of the novel, and this is the last 5 chapters of the novel, understand, this is where things finally started to work. The fact that Mim was supposed to be an Indian prince was largely forgotten by this point, and even though he didn't really have much of a character outside of the typical Piers Anthony male character, he was at least a lot more tolerable. Now this part of the book is almost entirely plot-driven, but the plot is actually very engaging here. Mim has to rescue, like I mentioned before, this damsel in distress from the confines of hell, and the way that he goes about doing that and the way that he eventually defeats Satan is actually really interesting and provides a lot more commentary on the nature of war and how it can be used as a tool than anything in the rest of the book. I also like the use of the book The Five Rings, which is mentioned throughout the novel, but really brought home in this section of the novel, and the role that it takes in helping us to understand the many different facets of war. But it almost just seems like too little too late, and I really wish that these elements could have been used in the earlier parts of the novel so that we could have seen this all throughout the story. Honestly, I could just read the last 5 chapters of the book and be completely satisfied. It's a very compelling story about the nature of war. It's just a shame we had to plod through the first 12 chapters to get to it. So, how do you give a rating on a book that is so mixed? This really does represent the paradox that is Piers Anthony. His writing is plodding and juvenile and sometimes borderline offensive, but then he comes out with a really strong idea. He writes these pointless, long, awkward scenes, but then he puts together a really compelling story. He focuses way too much on female anatomy and female appearance over female character, but then he turns around and says that virginity is just a male construct. What do you do with that? This is why Piers Anthony is such a problematic author for me to enjoy, because he can be good and he can be really talented, but so often he's not. As far as this book is concerned, you can skim through the first 2/3, but really it's the last 5 chapters that you really want to read. So on the worth meter, this is a quintessential worth skimming. And next in the Incarnations of Immortality series, we look at the 5th book, focusing on the incarnation of nature, being a green mother. See you then.